The year was 1944. With the successful invasion of Normandy and the subsequent breakthrough into France, the Allies seemed to be on the cusp of ultimate victory. The German military, once feared for its strength and precision, was crumbling beneath the weight of relentless Allied assaults. For many soldiers, victory was near. But in the wake of this triumph, the Allies faced an unexpected dilemma, an overwhelming flood of German prisoners of war. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, once poised to defend their homeland, now marched in defeat, their futures uncertain. The U.S. military, already stretched thin, found itself confronted by the sheer scale of its success. Victory had birthed a new and unexpected crisis: how to manage an unmanageable number of POWs. At first, the American soldiers had little sympathy for the men they had just defeated. The German soldiers, for their part, had expected a quick military loss, followed by an even swifter return home. What they faced, instead, was something far more brutal than they could have imagined. The conditions in the POW camps were beyond anything they had prepared for: overcrowded enclosures, little food, and even less shelter. Some camps were little more than makeshift pens, where prisoners were huddled together, exposed to the elements, vulnerable to the diseases that ran rampant. The prisoners' plight, though severe, was a reflection of the chaos that had spread across the European front. The Allies had won the war, but in the process, they found themselves battling an entirely different kind of struggle. The logistical challenges of housing, feeding, and guarding so many prisoners placed an unbearable strain on the American military. The camps became hotbeds of disease and despair. Tensions grew, and a profound sense of fatigue set in. For the American soldiers tasked with overseeing the prisoners, the situation was as mentally and physically exhausting as it was morally conflicting. They had fought for freedom, for the defeat of tyranny, but now found themselves responsible for the suffering of men they had once considered enemies. As weeks passed, some of the American soldiers found themselves asking difficult questions. Were these men truly the enemy, or had they simply been pawns in a war they didn't fully understand? The psychological toll on both the captors and the captives was immense. The malnutrition, the squalor, and the harsh conditions wore down the spirit of every man involved. The camps were not just a prison for the body, but for the mind as well. For the German soldiers, it was an emotional unraveling as the weight of defeat crushed their sense of identity. For the Americans, there was a quiet realization: the brutality of war does not end with victory. It echoes long after the battles are over. What was meant to be the final chapter of a devastating war had, in fact, become an ordeal of its own. And as the months passed, the full psychological cost of war, on both sides, began to reveal itself in ways that would haunt both captors and captives for years to come. But as the Allies struggled with this unexpected aftermath, another dark shadow was beginning to gather on the horizon, threatening to change the course of history yet again. By the summer of 1944, the United States had emerged as the dominant force in Europe. The D-Day invasion had broken the German defensive lines, and the Allied armies were advancing toward victory. But with this success came an unexpected burden: an overwhelming number of German prisoners of war. The Geneva Conventions, designed to ensure the humane treatment of captured soldiers, outlined strict guidelines for their care. However, as the POW camps across the United States began to overflow, it quickly became clear that the reality of war had blurred the lines of these rules. The very essence of humanity was being tested, not on the front lines, but within the confines of a camp. The conditions in these POW camps were grim. Overcrowded barracks, minimal shelter, and sanitation that barely met the most basic standards left the prisoners in a constant state of suffering. Men who had once marched proudly in the fields of Europe now found themselves crammed together in dirty, makeshift pens. The stench of illness and despair hung heavy in the air. Disease spread rapidly, making every cough and fever a silent threat. It was a far cry from the noble ideals that the Allies had fought to uphold. And yet, despite this, the American soldiers who guarded them found themselves trapped in an ironic struggle. How could they honor the very rules they were fighting for, when the situation on the ground seemed to violate them at every turn? The true cost of this situation was felt not only by the German prisoners, but also by the American soldiers tasked with managing them. The logistics of feeding and housing thousands of captives had stretched military resources thin. Morale among the American soldiers began to wane as they watched the conditions deteriorate. They had come to defeat an enemy, but now they found themselves struggling to preserve a semblance of dignity for those they had captured. Some soldiers, worn down by the brutal realities of war, responded with hostility, viewing the prisoners not as men, but as symbols of the enemy's evil. Others, however, fought silently, attempting to maintain decency in the face of overwhelming adversity, quietly offering comfort when possible. As disease spread and food grew scarcer, both captors and captives found themselves in a battle far removed from the war's front lines. But the real question that lingered was not about survival. It was about morality. In their bid to uphold justice and decency in the face of an enemy, could they preserve those very values when the struggle was no longer on a battlefield, but behind the wire fences of a camp? What the soldiers did not know was that this struggle would shape the final months of the war in ways they could never have imagined. As the Allies pressed on towards victory, a new moral test was unfolding on the home front. As 1944 stretched into 1945, the war's momentum continued to shift, and the German soldiers found themselves in a new, unrecognizable battle. It was no longer fought with weapons on the front lines. Instead, it was fought within their own minds, behind the barbed wire of American POW camps. The physical hardships of captivity were undeniable: overcrowding, inadequate food, poor sanitation. But the deeper, more insidious struggle lay beneath the surface in the emotional and psychological toll. For these soldiers, many of whom had once held prestigious ranks or fought fiercely in the brutal theaters of war, captivity was a humiliating and disorienting reality. No longer were they warriors, they were prisoners. Their identities, once rooted in duty and national pride, now crumbled in the face of uncertainty. They were stripped of purpose, reduced to mere numbers on a list, their lives a distant echo of the heroes they had once believed themselves to be. The irony of their situation was almost unbearable. These men, who had once given orders to the enemy or led attacks with calculated precision, now found themselves utterly dependent on those very same enemies for their survival. The soldiers who had once controlled their fate now sat passively, waiting for rations, for medical care, for any semblance of dignity in a situation designed to strip them of all. To be helpless, to have the power to control no aspect of one's existence, was a crushing reality for men who had been conditioned to believe in their own invincibility. For many, it was not the deprivation of food or the threat of disease that broke them. It was the slow, insidious erosion of their very sense of self. As the weeks turned into months, the mental strain began to show. Soldiers who had once felt invulnerable began to exhibit signs of despair, anxiety, and even suicidal thoughts. The future was no longer a distant possibility. It was a source of terror. Would they return home? Would they be tried for war crimes? Or would they spend the rest of their lives as prisoners in a foreign land, their lives reduced to a faceless, nameless existence behind bars? Many had no answers. The tension between hope and hopelessness was a constant companion, eating away at them from the inside. For the American soldiers tasked with guarding the camps, the situation was equally unprepared for. They were trained for battle, not for the nuanced psychological trauma that would unfold behind those fences. The toll of dealing with soldiers who were breaking down emotionally was something the guards had never anticipated. With food scarce and morale low on both sides, it became increasingly difficult to maintain order. Yet beneath the strained surface of their duties, a growing awareness emerged. This war, with all its victories and losses, had inflicted damage far beyond the battlefield. The true horror for the German soldiers was not the hunger or the sickness, it was the crushing psychological toll. The emotional scars of their captivity would never heal completely, even when the war ended. They had been broken in ways that no one could see, their identities erased in a way that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. And as the war drew closer to its end, a far darker shadow loomed over both captors and captives alike, a revelation that would forever alter the course of history. In the wake of victory, the American soldiers found themselves confronting an uncomfortable truth. Those they had once regarded as the enemy, the men who had fought against them on battlefields from Normandy to the Eastern Front, were now their responsibility. For many soldiers, the German prisoners of war were simply that, prisoners. They were the enemy, captured and defeated, and therefore deserving of whatever hardships they had to endure. The Geneva Conventions, though well-intentioned, seemed distant and abstract compared to the day-to-day struggles of running overcrowded camps. The belief, at least initially, was clear. The Germans had fought with ruthless aggression, and now they would bear the weight of their defeat. But as time wore on, the reality of captivity began to unsettle even the hardest soldiers. As American guards observed the German POWs, their faces gaunt from hunger, their bodies broken by the long march to surrender, it became impossible to ignore the profound psychological toll the men were experiencing. The emotional breakdowns of the prisoners were not just visible, but impossible to disregard. Some stood silent, eyes vacant, as if their souls had been emptied. Others screamed at nothing, lost in their own minds. These men, who had once been the embodiment of strength and military might, were now reduced to shadows of their former selves. And for the Americans who watched this unfolding tragedy, a moral dilemma began to take shape. Were they simply doing their duty as soldiers, following orders and keeping the prisoners contained? Or were they complicit in treating these men as less than human, part of a machinery of cruelty that extended beyond the battlefield? The irony of the situation was not lost on many of the American soldiers. Only months before, they had feared the German army's disciplined strength. The soldiers had been trained to kill these men, to neutralize them on the battlefield. Now they found themselves responsible for their survival. The roles had reversed. The victors were now caretakers, and the conquered were now helpless wards. The psychological burden of this shift was far heavier than they had expected. The camps were a microcosm of the war itself, brutal, exhausting, and ultimately dehumanizing for everyone involved. The men who had once fought for freedom now found themselves wrestling with their own complicity in a system of care that felt like neglect. Meanwhile, the camp commanders struggled with an overwhelming challenge. They had been given the task of managing not just prisoners, but people, men who had once been soldiers, fathers, sons, and citizens of a country now broken by defeat. The military's resources were stretched thin, and the influx of prisoners only worsened the situation. There were not enough rations, not enough shelter, not enough space. Tensions between the German POWs and their captors escalated. Violence flared in the camps, with outbreaks of riots and brutal acts of revenge on both sides. It was a desperate attempt to regain control, to cling to a semblance of agency in an environment where it was all but gone. As the months passed, the treatment of POWs became a growing point of contention. It was a subject that many wanted to ignore, buried beneath the gloss of victory and the victorious narrative. But for some, the question began to surface. Had the prisoners been treated with the dignity they deserved? Or had they been subjected to a new kind of warfare, one that targeted the mind and spirit as much as the body? For many American soldiers, this was an issue that could not be easily reconciled. And as the war edged closer to its final stages, a new revelation emerged. The POW camps had become a battleground of their own. The men inside, both captor and captive, were fighting an entirely different kind of war, one where the psychological toll of captivity had the power to shape the future as much as the physical toll of battle. What remained uncertain was how much longer the psychological strain could be borne before it broke them all. In the far corners of the world, the wheels of a new, even more devastating force were turning. A weapon, born of desperation and fear, was on the verge of being unleashed. The impact of this weapon would change the nature of war forever. As the months pressed on and winter descended in 1944, the American POW camps began to buckle under the strain. The cold was relentless, seeping into every corner of the camps, where the prisoners huddled together for warmth. With each passing day, overcrowding worsened and medical supplies, already in short supply, began to dwindle. Men who had once marched proudly across Europe now found themselves subjected to conditions far harsher than anything they had anticipated. It was a cruel irony. Those who had once been the invaders of foreign lands were now prisoners in a country they had once sought to conquer. The land they had fought so hard to control had become the very place where their survival would be decided, not by military might, but by the resilience of the human spirit. The cold was not the only enemy. The prisoners, once fierce and proud soldiers, began to show the toll that captivity had taken on their minds and bodies. For many, the hardest blow was the slow erosion of their identity. These were men who had been trained to fight for a cause, who had worn their uniforms with the pride of national loyalty. But in captivity, stripped of their ranks and reduced to mere numbers, that sense of purpose began to crack. The humiliation of being dependent on their captors, of begging for food, of waiting in line for the barest essentials, ate away at their sense of self. Many began to ask themselves, who were they now? What was the point of it all? As the long, brutal winter wore on, the once proud soldiers began to lose not just their physical strength, but their sense of who they were. Yet amidst the suffering, something remarkable began to emerge. The German POWs, though broken in spirit, found ways to adapt. In the absence of formal leadership, they turned inward, forming close-knit communities within the camp. They shared resources, even if it meant rationing the little food they had. Some began to organize covert resistance movements, determined to retain a semblance of agency, even if it was within the confines of their prison. They found strength in solidarity, in their shared suffering, and in the small acts of rebellion against the system that sought to strip them of their dignity. It was a quiet resistance, but it was resistance nonetheless, a fight for survival that transcended the physical and became deeply psychological. For the American guards tasked with overseeing the prisoners, the winter proved just as grueling. Many of these soldiers had been trained for combat, not for the delicate management of POWs, and the stress of dealing with the complex and often volatile dynamics within the camps began to show. They, too, were exhausted. The emotional and psychological toll on the guards was just as severe as it was for the prisoners. The constant tension, the fear of violence erupting, the deepening sense of frustration, all of it added up. Some soldiers began to show signs of fatigue and stress, their once clear sense of duty blurring under the weight of the situation. The camps were no longer just places of physical confinement. They were volatile environments where the pressure to survive weighed heavily on both sides of the wire. The true cost of survival, however, was not in the loss of life. It was in the mental and emotional scars that would last long after the war ended. For the POWs, the trauma of captivity would shape their futures in ways they couldn't yet understand. And for the American guards, the weight of what they had witnessed would haunt them for years to come. The war had not just ravaged the body, it had scarred the mind. What no one had anticipated when the war began was that the real battle would not be won with weapons. It would be fought within the minds of those who had lived through it. As the war neared its end, both the captors and the captives were beginning to come to terms with the deep psychological toll of their experiences. But the question remained, would they ever be able to heal? And how would they move forward with wounds that could never truly be erased? Soon the world would change again, in a way no one could predict. A new chapter was about to be written, one that would forever alter the course of history. As the war stretched into its final years, the U.S. government, ever aware of the delicate balance between victory and public perception, relied heavily on its wartime propaganda machine to maintain morale at home. The message was clear. American soldiers were the embodiment of justice and fairness, fighting not only for freedom abroad but for the values of honor and compassion. The treatment of prisoners of war, it was said, reflected this ideal. The narrative promoted was one of benevolent captors treating their defeated enemies with dignity and respect. The stories told of well-kept camps, rations in abundance, and a humane approach to warfare that stood in stark contrast to the atrocities being committed by the Axis powers. In the midst of a brutal conflict, this idealized version of America's wartime conduct helped keep the home front united, even as the realities of the war grew grimmer. Yet, as the war continued, cracks began to appear in this carefully constructed image. The truth about the conditions in the POW camps began to seep out, slowly at first, then more rapidly as soldiers and even some civilians began to question the disparity between the propaganda and what they had seen firsthand. The harshness of the camps, overcrowding, malnutrition, inadequate shelter, and the psychological toll exacted on both captors and captives was far removed from the fair treatment that was being promoted. Some American citizens who had initially rallied behind the message of victory and righteousness found themselves grappling with a disturbing realization. If America was truly fighting a war for moral superiority, how could it reconcile the suffering of the men it had captured? The irony of this situation was stark. The American government and its media apparatus presented the image of an army that fought not just for victory, but for humanity. The narrative sold to the public was that of benevolent soldiers, showing mercy to their enemies even in the face of bitter conflict. But on the ground, the reality was much different. Many German POWs faced horrific conditions, rations were scarce, disease spread unchecked, and psychological trauma became a constant companion. Some prisoners, their spirits crushed by the loss of their homes and families, struggled with despair and self-harm. Yet the official story, spun by the propaganda machine, painted a picture of restraint and fairness. The discrepancy between this polished version and the painful truth simmered beneath the surface. As the pressure mounted, camp leaders found themselves caught in a moral quandary. They were charged with maintaining order and discipline, but they were also human beings who witnessed the suffering firsthand. How much of this suffering should be revealed? On one hand, there was the desire to maintain the image of the United States as a paragon of moral virtue, to keep the home front believing in the righteousness of the cause. On the other, there was the uncomfortable reality that the conditions in the camps did not match the shining narrative being sold to the public. In the end, many opted to remain silent or offer only sanitized versions of the truth, perpetuating the myth of American benevolence at the cost of a more honest reckoning. The public's perception of how prisoners were treated remained stubbornly rosy. The image of the good American soldier, who fought for justice and treated prisoners with dignity, was upheld, even as the soldiers on the ground knew the truth. But as the war began to wind down and the horrors of captivity became undeniable, the gap between the narrative and the reality grew too wide to ignore. As the war ended, the disconnect between the government's carefully crafted propaganda and the soldiers' raw experiences would inevitably come to the forefront, sparking debates that would continue long after the war had ended. With the curtain beginning to fall on the war, one question remained. What would the American public do when they learned that the truth about their nation's conduct in the camps was far more complicated than the story they had been told? The answer was coming, but it would not be an easy one to face. As the war raged on into 1944 and 1945, the physical battle seemed clear, but a deeper, less visible struggle was unfolding behind the barbed wire of the POW camps. For many of the German prisoners, the horrors of warfare had been replaced by a new enemy, one they could not fight with weapons. It was an enemy that could not be seen, a relentless adversary that gnawed at the very core of their being, their own minds. The once proud soldiers, who had marched across Europe with purpose and discipline, now found themselves trapped in a mental and emotional limbo, struggling not to survive the war, but to maintain their sense of self in the face of crushing psychological isolation. The memories of battle, of loss, and of the slow erosion of their identities became the daily conflict, one that no amount of food or shelter could cure. In an attempt to provide some respite from the overwhelming mental toll, American guards, many of whom were beginning to see the psychological devastation unfold, attempted small acts of compassion. They organized sporadic games, arranged for occasional letters from home to reach the prisoners, and even encouraged a few prisoners to participate in makeshift sports matches. These gestures, though well-intentioned, were often fleeting moments of relief in a sea of endless uncertainty. For some prisoners, a few brief moments of camaraderie or a glimpse of a familiar face in a letter could spark a fleeting sense of hope. But the reality was far harsher. The emotional and psychological weight of captivity was far too great to be lifted by such small offerings. The prisoners, though grateful for these distractions, could not escape the fact that their lives were on hold, trapped in a cycle of confusion, despair, and waiting. Despite these moments of human kindness, the psychological toll on the POWs continued to mount. As the weeks turned into months, some prisoners began to form informal support networks, clinging to the bonds of solidarity that they could create. These small communities, born of shared suffering, became a lifeline for many. They helped each other find the strength to endure, passing what little resources they had, sharing stories from home, and reminding one another of the lives they had left behind. In the midst of this torment, they held onto their dignity and pride through the simple act of standing together. In this unity, however fragile, they found something they could not find in the solitary confinement of their own minds, a reason to keep fighting, even if that fight was no longer against the enemy, but against the darkness threatening to consume them from within. But the strain of captivity was far more insidious than anything they could have imagined. The emotional weight of imprisonment, the loss of identity, and the ongoing mental exhaustion began to manifest in profound ways. Some prisoners succumbed to despair, their will to live slowly eroding. Others developed strange coping mechanisms, rituals, obsessions, or even detachment from reality itself. It was as if their minds were slowly breaking under the pressure of not knowing what would come next, of not knowing if they would ever return to their families or their homes. In this environment, the line between surviving and surrendering became increasingly blurred. They had no weapons to defend themselves against this enemy. They could not escape it. It was everywhere, inside their thoughts, inside their bodies. It was the war they could never leave behind. The true struggle for the German POWs, however, was not only about food or shelter. It was about maintaining the will to survive under crushing psychological pressure. The despair, the anxiety, the loss of identity, these were the real killers. The camps had become a war within a war, a battle for mental and emotional survival that had the power to break even the strongest of men. This fight could not be won with ammunition, food rations, or medical supplies. It was a battle fought in the mind, where every day was a struggle to retain a sense of self-worth, to push back against the suffocating weight of hopelessness that threatened to swallow them whole. The mental scars that these soldiers bore would not fade with the war's end. While they might return to their homes, their bodies might heal, their wounds might close, but the psychological damage would linger, unseen but deeply felt. The truth of this war, as the war drew to a close, was that the impact would extend far beyond the physical realms of the battlefield. Both the German prisoners and the American soldiers who had guarded them would bear emotional scars that could not be erased, reshaping how both sides viewed the nature of war. In the end, it was not the victory that mattered most. It was the toll it took on the human mind. And as the final days of the war drew near, a new reality began to emerge for both captors and captives. What they hadn't yet realized was that the emotional cost of their shared experiences would shape the course of their lives for decades to come, far beyond the battlefield's reach. The wounds they could not see would last far longer than the ones they could. But even as the war closed its chapters, another shadow was gathering, one that would carry a weight of its own. As the war came to its climactic end in 1945, the Allied forces began to pull back, dismantling the vast network of POW camps that had once housed thousands of German soldiers. The long, grueling months of captivity were finally over for the men who had been held in these camps. Yet for many, the return home would not signal a return to normalcy. What awaited them in Germany was a country fractured by war, its landscape scarred by years of conflict. But far more devastating than the external destruction was the internal damage they carried with them. Mentally and physically broken, many of the prisoners were not the same men who had been captured. They returned home haunted by the invisible wounds of war, what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition that went largely unrecognized and untreated at the time. These soldiers, once proud and disciplined, had been broken not by the enemy, but by their own minds. Their bodies might have been freed from the chains of captivity, but their souls remained trapped in the psychological remnants of the war. The scars of their experiences, the sleepless nights, the flashbacks, and the deep sense of alienation from a world that could not understand their suffering would stay with them for years, if not for the rest of their lives. The irony of this situation was glaring. The United States, proud of its role in securing victory and providing humane treatment for its prisoners, had failed to recognize the true cost of the war on the human psyche. The U.S. military, having invested so much in the logistics of the camps, food, shelter, and basic health care, had failed to account for the emotional toll that such confinement would have on the men held within them. As POWs were slowly sent back to their families, they found that their country, having been focused on victory, was ill-prepared to offer the mental health support they so desperately needed. There was no system in place to treat the psychological trauma that so many had endured in captivity. The trauma of being imprisoned, separated from family and home, forced into a silent, endless waiting left deep emotional scars. And yet, the U.S. military's proudest narrative of treating POWs with fairness and compassion now seemed tragically incomplete. But the psychological toll was not one-sided. As the war drew to a close, another revelation began to surface, one that was just as unsettling: the American S. Soldiers and camp administrators, who had been responsible for the care and management of the prisoners, were themselves grappling with their own form of war trauma. The guards, many of whom had been thrust into the role of overseeing the POWs without proper training or psychological preparation, now found themselves dealing with the aftermath of their own emotional scars. They had witnessed the suffering of the men they had captured, had been exposed to the constant tension of maintaining order, and had seen the breakdown of both the prisoners and the system they had helped to enforce. Some were deeply disturbed by the cruelty they had witnessed, and at times been forced to participate in. Others struggled with guilt over the limitations of what they could do for the prisoners, knowing they were powerless to address the deeper psychological wounds. The mental health crisis was not just confined to the prisoners, it had now extended to those who had served as their captors. As the war ended, the full scope of the emotional damage began to come into focus, but it would be years before the lasting effects would be fully understood. For the POWs and the American soldiers alike, the war was far from over. Though the fighting had stopped, the emotional and psychological wounds would continue to fester long after the guns had fallen silent. As veterans returned home, many would find that their struggles had only just begun. The psychological toll of captivity, the fear, the humiliation, the uncertainty, and the trauma would remain a constant companion, a shadow that could not be outrun. For both the captors and the captives, the war would leave deep scars that would last far longer than the physical wounds ever could. The true scale of this emotional devastation was only beginning to be understood, as both American soldiers and former prisoners of war began to navigate a new kind of survival, one that required facing the mind, rather than the battlefield. This failure to treat the psychological wounds of war would change how future conflicts were approached. In the years that followed, mental health would gradually come to be recognized as a crucial component of military strategy, and the psychological well-being of soldiers, both during and after the conflict, would take on a new importance. But the scars of the past were still there, lurking beneath the surface. The war was not truly over for those who had survived it. It had merely shifted from the battlefield to the mind. And as the world slowly moved toward recovery, the question remained: how would the soldiers, both captors and captives, ever rebuild the parts of themselves that had been shattered in the camps? The answer was still unfolding, and its impact would shape the future of warfare and healing for generations to come. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, the surviving German prisoners of war returned home, their bodies scarred, their minds burdened with an invisible weight. These men who had endured years of captivity had been stripped of more than just their uniforms. They had lost pieces of themselves. Yet as they crossed back into a Germany ravaged by the war, they were met with indifference, their trauma largely ignored by the government and the society they returned to. The country, in its desperate bid to rebuild, focused on tangible efforts, repairing infrastructure, revitalizing its economy, and securing political stability. But the emotional wreckage left by the war was far less visible, and so it was relegated to the margins of public consciousness. For many of these men, there was no acknowledgement of the psychological scars that war and captivity had etched into their psyches. No programs to help them reintegrate, no resources to address the trauma they carried. The lingering wounds of their captivity, post-traumatic stress, anxiety, depression were invisible, and as a result, they festered in silence. The war had ended, but for these men, the real battle was just beginning. The irony of this post-war recovery is stark. The Allies, driven by an urgency to rebuild Europe, turned their focus on the physical reconstruction of the continent. Yet, in their haste to revive cities and economies, they failed to recognize the long-lasting psychological damage that had been inflicted, not just on soldiers, but on civilians as well. For the prisoners who had returned home, the physical evidence of war might have been less obvious than the ruins of a bombed city, but the trauma they carried was just as real. Their minds, battered by captivity, isolation, and the horrors they had witnessed, were now locked in an unspoken struggle. Yet in the face of their pain, they were largely left to suffer alone. The world around them moved forward, eager to rebuild, but the emotional devastation from the war was invisible, unspoken, and ultimately untreated. For these men, their suffering became part of the silent landscape of post-war Europe, quietly ignored by the very societies that had borne witness to their sacrifice. Some survivors tried to reintegrate into society, to return to some semblance of normal life, but the scars they carried, both visible and invisible, made it almost impossible to return to the lives they once knew. They had been changed by captivity in ways that defied easy comprehension. The men who returned were no longer the same men who had left. Their former selves had been shaped by a profound loss of agency, by the unrelenting weight of psychological trauma. They struggled to rebuild relationships with their families, who often didn't understand the extent of their suffering. The communities they re-entered had little to offer in terms of support, and the wounds these men carried were not just personal, they were collective. Society, eager to move forward, had little room for the internal battles fought in silence. For some, the attempt to reintegrate was an agonizing process of pretending to be whole again, when in reality, they remained broken in ways they could not express. The truth, however, is that the toll of war does not end when the fighting stops. The peace treaties may have been signed, the formal surrender declared, but for the survivors, both soldiers and civilians, the war continued to shape their lives long after the official battles had been won. In the years that followed, the trauma of war seeped into every facet of post-war life. Those who had been imprisoned, those who had fought, and even the families who had waited for them, all carried the scars of conflict. The true cost of war became not just a matter of land or power, but of minds that could never forget, of memories that could never be erased. The psychological toll of captivity, of loss, of fear, and of survival haunted those who lived through it, and it shaped the world that emerged after the war. But these scars were not confined to the generation that lived through the war itself. They were passed down. The emotional devastation inflicted by the conflict rippled outward, affecting not just the men who had served, but their families, their communities, and even the generations that came after. The children of these survivors grew up in households marked by the quiet but unmistakable presence of trauma. The inability to talk about the horrors of captivity, the silence that accompanied these scars, became a part of the social fabric of post-war Germany and beyond. The repercussions of war extended far beyond the battlefield, far beyond the immediate generation of soldiers who fought in it. The trauma was inherited, passed on in ways that shaped the culture of entire communities, leaving marks that no reconstruction effort could address. The moral irony is that the true cost of war, the psychological, emotional, and mental toll, is often overlooked in the histories we tell. History tends to focus on the tangible, the battles, the strategies, the treaties, the victory. Yet the internal costs, the battles that rage in the minds of those who lived through it, are less easily quantified, less easily acknowledged. The wounds of war are not always visible, but they linger in the lives of those who fought it, in the lives of those who survived it, and in the lives of those who came after. It is not just the physical battles fought on the front lines that define the cost of war. It is the psychological toll that remains long after the war is over, etched into the lives of those who were left behind. And as history moves forward, it's worth asking, how much of this silent legacy will we continue to ignore, even as we rebuild from the wars that still shape us? The answer, perhaps, is that the real cost of war is not only the lives lost, but the lives that continue to carry its weight, generation after generation. The war had ended, but for many, the battle had just begun. As the returning soldiers, whether from the Allied or Axis powers, stepped back onto their home soil, they were met with the stark reality of a world that could not comprehend the full weight of their experiences. The visible wounds of war were easy to see: shattered bodies, lost limbs, broken faces. But the deeper scars, the invisible wounds of the mind, were often overlooked. The returning POWs from both Germany and the US faced not only the challenge of physical recovery, but also the far more complex and debilitating task of repairing their shattered psyches. These men had endured captivity, torture, and isolation, experiences that would haunt them long after the war had officially ended. Yet, their governments, eager to move forward and rebuild, failed to acknowledge the true scope of the psychological trauma they had endured. The very systems designed to assist them in their return to civilian life were ill-prepared for the mental health crisis that would soon unfold. The symptoms of this crisis began to surface almost immediately. PTSD, anxiety, and depression became pervasive among returning soldiers, an epidemic that was largely ignored. The concept of shell shock had existed in military history, but the full understanding of trauma was still in its infancy. Many veterans were left to navigate their trauma in silence, without the support or resources they so desperately needed. Those who had survived the horrors of war and captivity now found themselves trapped in an internal battle that no one could see, a war waged not on foreign soil, but inside their minds. The trauma was not just physical, it was psychological, an ongoing battle that no one could prepare them for. The darkness of captivity, the loss of dignity, the constant fear of death, and the unbearable silence of waiting for something, anything, to change became a weight that these soldiers could not cast aside. No matter how far they traveled from the barbed wire or the horrors they had witnessed, their minds remained trapped in the same hell. In the United States, the response to this growing mental health crisis was slow and often non-existent. The government, which had been swift to care for the physical wounds of returning soldiers, did not yet fully grasp the magnitude of psychological trauma. PTSD was not yet recognized as a condition in its own right. Mental health care for veterans was limited, and the societal understanding of the psychological scars of war was almost non-existent. The U.S. military's focus was on reintegration, getting the veterans back to civilian life, back to work, back to their families, but without acknowledging the profound mental health needs that existed. In many cases, the veterans were expected to pick up the pieces of their lives as though the war had never happened. They were left to fight their internal battles alone, with little support or understanding from a society that was more focused on post-war prosperity than on the enduring trauma of those who had fought the war. The failure to address the mental health crisis after World War II would become a turning point in the way future wars were treated, especially in regard to veterans' mental health. It would take decades before the full scale of PTSD and other war-related mental health issues were recognized, and even longer before effective treatments were developed. But the absence of care in the years following the war left millions of veterans to struggle in isolation, with little recognition or help. The legacy of this neglect would shape the way wars were fought and understood in the decades to come. The psychological toll of war would no longer be an afterthought. It would be an integral part of the conversation about how soldiers were prepared, how they were cared for, and how they reintegrated into society after they returned home. For those who had survived the war, the psychological scars became a silent epidemic. Unlike the visible wounds of war, the emotional and mental trauma was often overlooked, dismissed, or misunderstood. Yet, for millions of veterans, it became a constant, silent battle. The trauma of captivity, the brutalities of battle, and the relentless anxiety that accompanied the knowledge that death was always just a step away lingered long after the war's official end. The minds of these soldiers, once sharp and focused in battle, were now fractured and broken by the weight of their experiences. The invisible scars, though unseen by the public eye, were no less real than any physical wound. In the years that followed, the ramifications of this unaddressed psychological trauma would echo through the lives of those affected. It would shape families, communities, and societies, passed down through generations, often unspoken but profoundly felt. These emotional scars, lingering in silence, would become an invisible epidemic, affecting not just the veterans who had fought, but their families, their children, and those who loved them. But the question remained, could these men ever truly heal from the psychological wounds of war, or would they carry the weight of their experiences with them forever? The true cost of war was far more than the battles fought on the front lines. It was the unseen, unresolved conflict within the minds of those who returned, and its effects would continue to shape future generations. What began as a war of survival had become a war for the soul, a war that never truly ended. And as the years wore on, one could not help but wonder, how long would it take before society would finally confront the silent legacy of the mental toll of war? By the 1950s, the full scope of the psychological damage inflicted by World War II was beginning to surface. Veterans, long overlooked, began to grapple with the mental toll of their experiences, though not all had the words to describe what they felt. They had returned home to heroes' welcomes, but the invisible scars they carried did not show on their faces. Their minds, however, bore the weight of battle, captivity, and loss. This new enemy was far more insidious than any they had encountered in war. It could not be seen or touched. PTSD, depression, and anxiety had taken root in their minds, lingering in silence. The struggle was not just to reintegrate into civilian life, but to silence the demons that plagued them from within. For years, these veterans had fought their own private battles, and now the world was slowly beginning to recognize the trauma they had endured. But for many, the acknowledgement came too late. The war may have ended, but for these men, the fight was far from over. The irony of this recognition was hard to ignore. These were the same men who had fought for freedom, for democracy, for the ideals of justice. Yet, upon their return, they were denied the care they so desperately needed to heal from the psychological wounds of war. The society that had celebrated their sacrifices now failed to offer them the help required to navigate the trauma they carried. The government, slow to act, had focused its resources on rebuilding the physical infrastructure of the country, roads, cities, industries, while the mental recovery of its soldiers was left in the shadows. These veterans, who had been lauded for their role in securing peace, found themselves abandoned when it came to their emotional recovery. They were told to move on to rebuild their lives as though nothing had happened. But the wounds of war, those hidden deep within, refused to heal with time. Gradually, however, a shift began to take place. The medical community, long focused on treating the physical scars of war, began to acknowledge the importance of addressing mental health as part of the recovery process. Doctors and psychiatrists started to recognize the signs of PTSD and began to understand the long-term effects of psychological trauma. The idea that mental health was just as important as physical health began to take root in medical circles. Slowly, veterans were given the opportunity to receive care, though this process was far from uniform. Some hospitals opened their doors to those seeking help, while others continued to dismiss psychological trauma as something that could simply be overcome with time. Despite the slow progress, the doors to recovery began to open. It was a start, but far too many veterans had already slipped through the cracks. For some, the mental health reforms that began to take shape in the 1950s came far too late. Many veterans, already deep in the grips of their psychological injuries, had suffered in silence for years. The toll of untreated trauma, of years spent battling invisible demons, left many of them struggling to survive in a world that seemed indifferent to their pain. Some found solace in their communities, seeking quiet refuge in shared understanding. Others, however, could not reconcile their experiences with the life they returned to. Their struggles, though slowly being recognized, remained unresolved. The emotional scars they carried would shape their futures in ways that were impossible to foresee. The effects of the war for them were permanent. They had fought for freedom abroad, but when they returned, they found themselves imprisoned by their own minds. The moral irony of this neglect was stark. These men had fought and sacrificed for the greater good, yet the very systems that were meant to protect and care for them after the war failed to provide the support they needed. The lack of attention paid to psychological injuries during and after the war would reverberate for generations, leaving lasting scars on the families, communities, and societies that surrounded these veterans. The failure to recognize the full extent of the psychological toll on those who fought in the war was an oversight that shaped not only their lives, but also the lives of their children and grandchildren. The emotional fallout from the war stretched far beyond the battlefield, rippling through society in ways that would only become clear in the years to come. As the 1950s unfolded, the true cost of war began to be more clearly understood. It wasn't just the loss of life, the battlefields, or the ravaged landscapes that defined the aftermath. The war's real cost was carried in the minds of those who survived it. The trauma, the invisible wounds, had the power to last long after the war was over. It became clear that recovery, both personal and societal, was not simply about rebuilding homes and economies. It was about acknowledging and addressing the emotional toll that war took on those who fought, and on the generations that followed. The question remained, however, would the world ever fully understand the extent of the psychological damage inflicted by war, or would it continue to be relegated to the margins, ignored until the next generation of soldiers returned home with wounds of their own? The road to recovery had only just begun, but it was clear that the journey would take much longer than anyone could have anticipated. And as the world moved forward, one thing remained. Certain, the true cost of war was not just counted in lives lost, but in minds broken and souls scarred forever. As the 1960s dawned, the world continued to rebuild from the ashes of the war. The cities of Europe began to rise from the rubble, the economies of the Allies flourished, and new generations grew up far removed from the horrors of the past. Yet, for the children and grandchildren of the men who had fought and suffered through World War II, the scars of that conflict did not fade with the passing years. The psychological wounds of the war, though unseen, had traveled beyond the front lines, quietly seeping into the lives of those who had never experienced the violence of battle firsthand. The children of veterans, many of whom had grown up with fathers who never spoke of their traumatic experiences, began to feel the weight of that unspoken history. The emotional toll of the war became an inherited burden, passed down without consent, without understanding, but deeply felt. These descendants, caught in the generational ripple of trauma, often found themselves struggling with the same issues their fathers had faced: depression, anxiety, and a sense of disconnection. The veterans, when they returned home, had carried the psychological scars of war with them, but now those scars were being transferred to the next generation. PTSD, once a term that described the invisible wounds of soldiers, was now being recognized in the children of those who had lived through the war. The unspoken trauma, the unresolved grief, and the unaddressed emotional damage reverberated through families, creating a cycle of pain that seemed impossible to break. The veterans had fought their battles on the front lines, but the war had not stayed there. It had followed them home, embedded itself in their relationships, in their homes, in the way they raised their children. For many, the war they thought had ended never truly left. The irony of this legacy was undeniable. While the world celebrated the end of the war, the truth was that the conflict never truly ceased for those who had lived through it. The aftermath of the war was not just measured in the rebuilding of cities, but in the quiet suffering of those who had returned home. The trauma they carried was not confined to the battlefield or the immediate aftermath. It stretched forward into the future, shaping the lives of their families. For the children of veterans, the effects were subtle yet profound. They could not always articulate why they felt the way they did, why they carried the weight of an invisible burden. But the signs were there. Emotional instability, strained relationships, an inability to cope with the everyday challenges of life. They had inherited the psychological scars of a war they had never fought in, a war that was still being fought quietly in their minds. The moral closure of this reality was haunting. They fought the war, but it was the war that never left them. For these veterans, the war was not over when the last shot was fired or when the peace treaties were signed. It remained within them, in their hearts and minds, shaping their lives in ways they could never have anticipated. And for their children, the legacy of war was something they had not chosen but could not escape. The cycle of trauma, once passed down from one generation to the next, became a quiet inheritance, one that was hard to break and even harder to understand. Yet the 1960s also brought a turning point. As society began to recognize the emotional and psychological impact of war on its soldiers, a wider understanding of trauma emerged. The concept of generational trauma, how the psychological wounds of war could be passed down to the next generation, began to take shape. Research into PTSD and the long-term effects of war on families gained traction, and conversations about the psychological toll of war became more open. This shift in understanding did not erase the pain, but it allowed for a more honest reflection on the ways in which the war continued to shape lives long after the conflict itself had ended. It opened a door to healing, though that healing would come slowly, and only after decades of struggle and denial. The true cost of war, it became clear, was not just the loss of life or the destruction of cities. It was the toll on the human mind, the minds of the soldiers who fought and the minds of those who lived in their shadow. The trauma of war was not something that could be measured in battles won or lost. It was something that lingered in the quiet moments of everyday life, in the broken relationships, in the silent suffering that stretched across generations. War did not end when the fighting stopped. It continued to shape the lives of those who had been touched by it, carrying its weight long into the future. And so, as the world moved further away from the battlefields of Europe, the question remained, would society ever fully understand the depth of the psychological wounds of war? Or would the legacy of trauma continue to haunt the generations that followed, unspoken but deeply felt? What was clear was that the true cost of war could not be measured by victory or defeat, but by the emotional scars left behind, scars that would take years, even decades, to fully comprehend. The war had never truly ended. Its shadow stretched far beyond the front lines. In the quiet of those who lived through it, and in the memories of those who came after, the war's legacy would live on. What began as a battle for survival had become a battle for understanding and for healing. As the war ended, the world began to focus on rebuilding. Cities, economies, and lives that had been shattered by conflict slowly started to mend. Yet, for the veterans who returned home, the true cost of war was just beginning to emerge, not on the battlefield, but deep within their minds. The wounds of war, which no amount of reconstruction could heal, had found their place in the hearts and minds of those who had fought. The public's attention, fixated on the physical rebuilding of nations, often overlooked the invisible damage, the psychological trauma, that lingered far beyond the last shot fired. Veterans were hailed as heroes, but their minds, marked by years of violence, captivity, and fear, carried burdens that were impossible to see. For many, this burden was a weight they could not put down. Post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, and depression became pervasive among the returning soldiers. They had fought for victory, for their countries, and for freedom, but the scars they carried were not those of battle. These were scars of the soul, of minds broken by the horrors of war and captivity. The men who had faced the front lines now found themselves in an even more dangerous struggle, the war within. The psychological wounds were just as real as any physical injury, but they were often dismissed, ignored, or misunderstood. In the quiet spaces of their homes, behind closed doors, veterans fought a battle that no one could see, a battle that would never end. The moral irony of this situation was profound. The war had ended in victory, but for many, it felt like the real war was only beginning. They had fought for freedom and democracy, but no one had prepared them for the emotional and psychological toll that such a fight would demand. While their governments celebrated the end of hostilities, the veterans who had sacrificed everything were left to cope with the aftermath in silence. Their struggles went largely unnoticed as the world rushed to move on. The very men who had endured the hardest of battles were now expected to return to normal life as though nothing had changed. But everything had changed. They were not the same men who had left, and the world they returned to was not the one they had left behind. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, social programs began to slowly recognize the mental health crisis that was unfolding among veterans. The concept of psychological treatment for veterans, an idea that had been virtually unheard of, began to take shape. Doctors, once focused solely on physical health, started to understand that recovery was not complete without addressing the psychological wounds. Still, the process was painfully slow. The military and government were reluctant to fully accept the scale of the damage, and the programs that did exist were underfunded and understaffed. Some veterans sought help, but many struggled in silence, unsure where to turn or whether they would be understood. They had fought for freedom, but now they were left to fight for the right to heal. The turning point came when mental health care for veterans began to be more systematically incorporated into the fabric of post-war recovery. Slowly, social awareness shifted, and the long-overdue recognition of PTSD and the psychological toll of war gained traction. But for many, this acknowledgement came too late. The damage had already been done. Veterans, who had fought to protect the freedoms of others, now faced a battle for their own mental well-being that many were not equipped to fight. Their families, too, were impacted. Children grew up with fathers who could not speak of their pain, who were distant, withdrawn, or emotionally unavailable. The trauma that had been passed down, sometimes silently, sometimes explosively, shaped families, communities, and entire generations. The unsung cost of war, as it became clearer, was not measured in casualties or battlefield victories. It was the mental health crisis that followed, one that would shape the lives of not just the veterans, but their families and society as a whole. The toll of war was not just in what happened on the front lines, but in the minds of those who fought. And while the world moved forward, the effects of that trauma echoed in the lives of the survivors and their loved ones. The revelation that the true cost of war is not just the loss of Lee, but the emotional toll borne by those who return is a truth that cannot be ignored. The mental wounds of captivity, battle, and trauma affected not just the soldiers, but the entire fabric of society. The fight did not end with the last shot, the last surrender, or the last peace treaty. The real fight, as many veterans would learn, was the one they would never escape. They fought for freedom, but the real fight would be the one they would never escape. The battle for peace of mind, for healing, was an ongoing struggle, and it became clear that the consequences of war stretched far beyond the battlefield, into the very hearts and minds of those who survived. And as the decades passed, the world began to ask, how would society learn from the scars left behind? Would the legacy of war, psychological and emotional, ever be fully understood? Or would it continue to haunt the survivors and their families, just as it had haunted the soldiers who fought so many years ago? The road to healing was only beginning. The emotional cost of war is a debt that is never truly paid. It is a hidden burden, one that lingers in the shadows long after the battles have ceased and the dust has settled. The physical ruins can be rebuilt, the cities restored, but the psychological scars, those invisible marks left deep in the hearts and minds of the survivors, are often overlooked, ignored, or misunderstood. Yet these scars are not confined to individuals. They ripple outward, affecting entire nations. The legacy of trauma spreads, unacknowledged, leaving behind a generation of people who carry the weight of history in silence. And while the war may have ended with victory, the battle that followed, one fought within the minds of soldiers and civilians alike, has shaped nations in ways that are still unfolding today. Even in victory, the emotional toll of war became a silent epidemic, affecting countless individuals in ways that were not fully understood at the time. Soldiers who had returned home were hailed as heroes, their service celebrated as the backbone of freedom. Yet for many, the war never truly ended. The pain of captivity, the trauma of battle, and the loss of comrades became a daily struggle that was often dismissed, ignored, or brushed aside by a society eager to move on. The battle had been won, but it was the quiet internal wars, those fought within the minds of the veterans, that would shape their futures. The irony of this situation is striking. Even in victory, many soldiers found themselves abandoned by the very systems that had sent them to war in the first place. The emotional costs of their sacrifice went unnoticed for far too long, creating a generation of men and women who fought battles not on foreign soil, but within themselves. It was not until decades later that the need for recognition of mental health in the aftermath of war became a moral imperative. Slowly, the public began to acknowledge that the wounds of war are not always visible. The psychological toll of conflict was starting to be understood as a crisis that needed to be addressed, and not just for the veterans who had fought, but for future generations as well. What began as a gradual shift in the way mental health was perceived became a slow and steady movement to provide proper care for those who had been emotionally scarred by their experiences. The recognition of PTSD, the acknowledgement of mental trauma as a serious condition, marked a turning point in how the world viewed the aftermath of war. For the first time, the emotional cost was being measured, but it was clear that much more work remained to be done. The truth, however, is that many veterans were left behind in the struggle to heal. The systems put in place were slow, often underfunded, and insufficient to address the scale of the problem. As the decades passed, many of the men who had returned from war found themselves still trapped by the weight of their own memories. The emotional cost of war was not something that could be healed quickly or easily. It was a long, hard journey that required both societal recognition and personal courage. But even as some veterans struggled in silence, the effort to address this crisis never stopped. Advocates for mental health care, veterans organizations, and medical professionals continued to push for reforms that would help those who had served in battle find a path to recovery. The real lasting legacy of the war, then, is not just in the victory itself, but in the ongoing fight for mental health care for future generations. The war may have ended, but the psychological toll, those unseen injuries, remained, affecting not just those who had fought, but also their families and communities. The fight for mental health awareness and treatment continues to this day, as new generations of soldiers return home, each one carrying the weight of their own experiences. The trauma of war is not something that fades with time. It is a legacy passed down, one that will take generations to heal. But the work to ensure that those who return from conflict receive the care they need is a battle that must continue. And in this ongoing struggle, the question remains, how long will it take for society to fully recognize and address the psychological costs of war? Will the fight for healing ever truly end, or will it be a battle that is always fought in the shadows? The wounds of war, after all, are never truly gone. They live on in the memories, the minds, and the hearts of those who survive. The war may end, but the fight for healing never truly does. The horrors of war are often recorded in the headlines, the battlefields, and the treaties. Yet there is another war, one fought in silence, a war that is rarely spoken of but whose effects endure long after the final shots are fired. For the prisoners of war, especially those held in captivity during World War II, this silent war was the battle for their minds. It was a struggle so profound that it often drowned out the external chaos of the war itself. When they returned home, many never spoke of their time in the camps. The world outside had moved on, eager to rebuild, but the scars they carried, those invisible wounds, had no place in the post-war narrative. They had survived the physical horrors, the malnutrition, the brutality, but what they had never learned to cope with was the psychological trauma that lingered long after the gates of the camps had closed. They never spoke of it, but it was the only thing they could hear. For those who endured the psychological torment of captivity, the true cost of war was not just the physical devastation, but the lasting mental scars that the world could not see. The stories of survival were often overshadowed by the stories of victory, as if the horrors of captivity were a footnote in history. But these silent wounds were no less real. The struggle to regain one's identity, to reconcile with the loss of self, was a battle that continued long after the war ended. The POWs had lost more than their freedom. They had lost their place in the world, their dignity, their sense of worth. And yet, when they returned home, they were expected to re-enter society as though nothing had happened. The world that welcomed them back had no understanding of what they had endured, no understanding of the silence that still screamed inside their minds. The story of the POWs is one largely forgotten by history, but incredibly significant in understanding the true cost of war. For many, the war was not something that ended with the signing of treaties or the declaration of peace. It continued to echo in their minds, in the quiet moments of solitude when the memories flooded back. These were not battles fought with weapons, but battles fought with memories, with fear, with an overwhelming sense of helplessness. The POWs had seen things that no human should have to endure. They had witnessed the slow erosion of their own humanity, the loss of their comrades, the crushing weight of despair. But no one wanted to hear about it. The world had moved on, and in doing so, it turned its back on the very men who had paid the price for the peace others now enjoyed. The silence became a way to survive. They had learned to lock the memories away, to silence the screams that would not cease. But those who survived carried the weight of that silence with them every day. In the years that followed, the full extent of the psychological toll of captivity would become clearer. But for many, it was too late. The war was over, but the battle for mental peace had only just begun. As veterans returned home, there were no programs for psychological support, no acknowledgement that their minds were still prisoners to the memories they had tried so hard to forget. The world did not want to confront the invisible wounds of war. They were too difficult to understand, too painful to acknowledge. And so the veterans who had fought for freedom were left to fight for their own peace of mind, often in silence. The weight of their suffering was carried not just by them, but by their families, their communities, and their countries. But no one could see the cost. The real war was never won. It continued in the minds of those who survived it. The silence of the POWs, this silent battle they fought every day, was the loudest echo of war. It was the echo that haunted them long after they had returned to the safety of their homes. They never spoke of it, and yet it was the one thing they could never escape. The psychological toll of captivity did not end with the final battle or the return to civilian life. It endured, and it shaped the lives of those who lived through it in ways that no victory could ever heal. For many, the cost of survival was more than just the physical scars. It was the mental and emotional damage that would define their lives forever. As history moves forward, the story of the POWs is often overlooked, relegated to the shadows of the larger narrative. But the silence they carried, the trauma they never spoke of, is a reminder that the cost of war is never fully understood. The real battle is not always fought on the battlefield. It is fought within the hearts and minds of those who survive, and that battle, for many, will never truly end.